Well, welcome everyone. We're really grateful that you've come to this event entitled Defense Procurement and the US Canadian Defense Cooperation. It's wonderful to have you here. The University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Innuak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota Ute, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. UM recognizes that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong, enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. My name is Dr. Andrea Sharon. I'm a professor in international relations, and I'm the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies. And I'm thrilled to be joined with US Consul Rebecca Molinoff and to be jointly hosting this event on an issue that is becoming more and more relevant, but less and less understood. So with that, I would like to invite US Consul Rebecca Molinoff to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here today. Thank you so much to Andrea for hosting us. On behalf of the US Consulate in Winnipeg, I'm delighted to be co-hosting Dr. Jerry McGinn today. We jumped at the chance to invite Dr. McGinn to Winnipeg when we saw his CV, because as one of America's leading experts in defense procurement, government contracting, and security policy issues, I believe his insights are especially relevant in Manitoba right now. I got to Manitoba about a year and a half ago as the U.S. Consul. I've been living in Winnipeg since then, and I believe from everything that I've seen that Manitoba is very well positioned to benefit from Canada's increased investments in defense. This province boasts a world-class aerospace sector, a highly educated and stable workforce, and a tradition of innovation. And Winnipeg is a hub for advanced manufacturing and research and logistics, all key ingredients for a thriving defense industrial base. And I don't have to tell you all that Manitoba's universities are also well placed to provide a pipeline of talent for years to come. So I think we have the right people in the room for the right conversation at the right time. And I'll tell you just a little bit more about Dr. McGinn's background. So Dr. McGinn is the director of the Center for the Industrial Base and a senior fellow with the Defense and Security Department. Prior to joining CSIS, he served as the executive director for the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. Before that, he was the senior career official in the DoD's Office of Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. And before that, he was with Northrop Grumman for about 10 years, Deloitte Consulting, and Kinetic North America. He also served as the special assistant to the principal deputy undersecretary for policy in DoD and as a political scientist at RAND. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry McGinn.
As you can see, I can't keep a job, right? It's an honor to be here. Thanks very much for your attendance. And so we got students here, right? And we got faculty here and members of the public, I think, right? So it's wonderful to be here, and I want to thank Rebecca and Laura from the Consulate team for the invitation to come to Winnipeg, and Andrea for your partnership and your leadership in the defense and security studies here at University of Manitoba. I still teach at George Mason University. In fact, a couple of slides actually come from some of the classes that I teach. I teach around business and strategy and government contracting. So it's a big business, and it's going to be a bigger business here in Canada. So it's a real, I think, historic opportunity for students and for faculty to really kind of learn more and kind of help Canada through in this journey. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a little bit about how how governments buy things, procurement. All right. Then I'm going to talk a bit about U.S. Canadian defense cooperation. And then I want to talk about, sort of the things that are happening now, and how do we, what should we be thinking about going forward? But first, this has been a tremendous week. I've been in Halifax and Ottawa and now Winnipeg. This is my first time in Halifax and in Winnipeg. I've been in other parts of Canada, and forgive my spelling. I know I got the S instead of the C's, but that that's just an American versus the Queen's English. So, it's been really the strength of the U.S.-Canadian relationship has been present throughout my time here. When I was in Halifax, I walked through the city, and you see the statue there right outside of City Hall about the Nova Scotians that served in the Great War, that served in World War II, served in Korea. And those were sometimes alongside the U.S., sometimes separately. But then the Canadian forces have served in the Balkans and in Bosnia and Kosovo, as well as in Afghanistan with American forces. So cooperation has been and partnership has been important for decades, and it will continue to be so. There are some challenges at the moment, but we'll confront those. But my point to you is that some of the rhetoric may not be ideal at the moment, but the actual reality of cooperation, defense cooperation, is real. It's historic, and it is present, and it continues. So, all right. So let's talk. So the defense industrial base, or the overall government contracting industrial base, it is quite big. I mean, there are over 200,000 companies that make up our industrial base. A lot of this I'm talking about the U.S., but essentially for the U.S. and Canada, under U.S. law, Canada and the United States are one industrial base. So Canadian companies can compete for U.S. procurements just as an American company in a lot of different ways. There's a memorandum of understanding between the two governments that basically respects the procurement laws of both countries, and it allows U.S. companies to compete for Canadian goods procurements and likewise. And that's why you have lots of U.S. subsidiaries here in Canada. Here in Manitoba, you've got GE Aviation, you've got Boeing, and lots of other companies. And then in the United States, you have CAE, you've got Bombardier that have subsidiaries as well. So you've got it's on both sides of the border, and you have kind of unique relationships there. So there's 200,000 companies, and there's basically two types of companies. In general, companies either provide products or they provide services. There's usually not too much of a mix. There's exceptions to that. So for products, you've got your Boeings, Magellan Aerospace, Lockheed. They provide systems or subsystems, or they provide capabilities that fit into a larger overall system, like an aircraft or a ground vehicle or a submarine or a ship and the like. And those companies, they sometimes will do service on their equipment, but in general, they do products. And then there are companies that do services. They do cybersecurity services. They work on IT. They do office support work. They do high-end analysis, intelligence analysis. And those are companies, like CAE is a Canadian company that does that. SAIC, Booz Allen, some of the big U.S. companies that do that as well. And then there's two principal roles in the government contracting space. There's the role of the prime contractor. Who knows what a prime contractor is? Sir.
The large global multinational, like a Boeing, Lockheed Martin, would be a prime contractor. Those dealing directly with the government to get the large defense contracts.
Exactly. So a company that is, government contracts with a company. It's just the same in Canada as well. The government contracts with one company to deliver an overall product. All right, so that company is the prime contractor. Sometimes they're big firms like Boeing, but a lot of times they're small firms. There are small firms, that have contracts with the government. Some contracts are set aside for small businesses, or some companies have unique capabilities. So it's not just the big companies that are prime contractors, but the prime contractor is the one that has the relationship with the government. And then everyone else, does that prime contractor deliver the capability all themselves, or do they have partners along the way? They generally have partners, and they're called subcontractors. And some companies are subcontractors and prime contractors. Some companies are just prime contractors. Some are just subcontractors. So, but when you're a subcontractor, you don't have a relationship with the government. You have a relationship with the prime contractor or another subcontractor. In general, there's five, we call them the big five. These are the companies, like Boeing has a facility here, or Raytheon is now RTX, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. General Dynamics has a big facility in Canada, I think it's Ontario or Quebec. All right, and they do about, we'll talk about how much business it. Then there's the middle tier, and these are the top 100 or so companies. These are companies that do, the big five do from about $50 billion in revenue a year to about $30 billion, 30 to 50. And some of these mid-tier, they can do $500 million US a year, $2 billion a year, $10 billion a year. Like BAE Systems is one of those companies. And Bombardier probably fits in there as well as CAE, and Magellan Space probably fits in there as well. So these middle tier companies, and there are a couple hundred of those, and then there are the big ones. But then the rest are the smalls, and there are lots of them. Right? I met some of them yesterday. They do 3D printing. They do, and there's an iron foundry here in Manitoba. These companies that provide services or specialized products, and there are shed loads of them. Right? Some from the native First Nations have companies that do business with the government. Likewise, in the U.S., there are a lot of special category small businesses. So, and then the industrial base is made up of tiers. Which will, so as I mentioned, the contracting is done almost exclusively with the prime contractors. There's some aspects like for engines and in major systems the government will contract with the subcontract, but in general they do with the primes. So and then they hold the primes accountable. But you see, the way it works out is you have a whole kind of a pyramid or a tiering of companies. The companies at the top, they're the ones that book the revenue in terms of they deliver the final end item, the F-35 fighter jet, the aircraft carrier, the frigate, the space, the satellite. But the revenue doesn't all go to them. It flows down to these different tiers of contractors. So tier 2 contractors are the major subsystems. They make the radars, the engines, that really kind of help the integration, the command and control systems. And then as you go down, you see, the wiring, the components, the parts, down to build-to-print manufacturing shops that make, bolts and fasteners and seals that go into systems. And then down through even the mining companies or the critical minerals producers and the refinement of those. And so you get down these tiers, those companies are all fit in there. And a lot of the companies down here have no idea what's going on up top. They have no idea even what their products are going into a lot of times because there's not a lot of visibility up and down the supply chain. Because those supply chains are not owned by the government. They're from company to company. And so, a company, they're very kind of protective of their supply chain because they have strong relationships with suppliers, and they use that as their competitive advantage. So, the supply chain, this tiering, it just shows there are lots of different companies of all shapes and sizes contribute to an overall system. So, how does this structure translate into money, into dollars? This is U.S. Department of Defense. This is from 2009 fiscal year. Our fiscal year goes from October 1st until September 30th. Here's it, March to March is the fiscal year? Okay. So our fiscal year, so these are looking at fiscal year 2009 through 2023. And you're looking at the top line goes up and down. You can see the beginning was during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and as that drew down, we had then the Great Recession or sequestration. We were spending a little bit less on defense. Then we spiked up, and 2020 was COVID, so that was kind of a unique kind of spending on vaccines and so on that actually went through the Department of Defense. But you see there's an up and down a cycle of overall spending. The Canadian spend on defense is a little bit less, so a little less than this. But it's similar. It's going to be similar ups and downs. But the point about this chart is looking at the colors. All right. So if you look at the top band is the blue, those are the top 5 companies. All right. And if you take those companies, so those are over $1 billion, and then the gray band, that's $250 million to $1 billion. So if you take those two groups of companies, that's about 45% of all revenues. All right. Now, do they get all that? They get all that revenue, but is that all go into their coffers? Do they deliver on all that? No, it goes. They keep about 20% because of the parts that they do, the integration, the components they make, but the rest goes to their subs. All right, the next grouping, the yellow, are those companies that are between 25 and 250 million. So that's probably where like Magellan Space fits in, Standard Aero might fit in there. So those are companies that have prime contracts in addition to subcontract, but we're just looking at prime contracts here. And then the bottom is our small businesses under 25 million. And that's about, it is, it's about 13, but it's really overall about 20%. But what can you say about these bands? Do they vary a lot, or are they pretty consistent in terms of the overall distribution? Pretty consistent. So the budget goes up and down, but the spread of business to companies is pretty consistent. Even COVID, which was really, that was pretty historic times. We did about 25% of the business was done through small businesses, right? So it's even during those kind of emergency times it happened. So, all right. Now, so that's kind of the money and how it gets, what companies get different pieces of it. But what is unique about the government contracting sector about these kind of business? How is it different from commercial industry? My iPhone's over there. You all have Androids and so on. So when Apple or whoever makes the phone makes that phone, right? They're creating it. They're developing an idea, and then who are the customers for those products? Well, it's each of us, right? So, and the company they put the research and development in. They build a product in the hopes of getting customers and growing that market. So is the ability to grow the market in the commercial space is driven by the product itself, right? So if it's a successful product, it grows and becomes bigger and bigger, and the market can grow. So that's the commercial market. So you build it and they will come, or you hope they will come. The government contracting marketplace is very, very different. We've got customers, but who are the customers in the government contracting space? The government, right? Different government offices, right? So it's could be the Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, or the US Air Force, a different office in there. So they are the customer, right? And the markets are based around those customers. And then companies build products and services to serve those customers. So it's a different kind of market. Does anyone know the term? Any economists in here? All right. Huh? Close. Monopsony. Monopsonist, right? Because the government is the one customer. So you have many companies, one customer. It's actually a series of monopsony markets. You got, the Air Force has got, it's the inverse of kind of the commercial world. So you've got a monopsony where you have one customer and companies trying to service that customer. So that's very, very different. So that drives kind of your market strategy, how you enter the business, how you develop products. Are you smart if you're in the government contracting business to build a tank and then try to sell it to the government? Is that a good idea? I mean, because you could invest billions of dollars in making a tank. So this is exactly what the government needs. But if the government doesn't need it, doesn't buy it, what are you going to do with that? You're not going to You're not going to go down to the Chevy dealer and down the street and sell it. So you really have to develop the customer has to develop the requirements, and so your marketing, your business development, it's all very different than the commercial world. Oops, what did I do there? There we go. And this is the case. This is our U.S. customers, but it's the same. It's the same here in Canada. So, but then, how does the government buy? Right. So those are the markets. They're kind of focused around the customers, right? But then how does the government buy? In some ways, it's like it's like a consumer, like you and I. Government can buy with a credit card. Assuming you have that here in Canada, right? For certain small items, laptops, office furniture, you use a credit card. You can buy through a catalog. In some ways, there's approved schedules on pricing for certain things that are kind of, again, office use or that are less expensive, so you could buy it at a lower price based on government, through a government catalog. And you can buy it through competition. Now, when you're buying a new car, you do a competition, right? You go to a bunch of different dealers, you test drive and so on, so you're doing a competition. The government does competitions, right? And that's where they do the majority. Everything over about $500,000 is done through competition, pretty much. But that's where things are not the same. So the government buys. It's a very heavily regulated market. It's pretty regulated here, I think, in Canada as well, right? You have very strong federal regulations. We have the Federal Acquisition Regulation. I'm sure you've got the equivalent. And then there's statutory requirements. You got there's a Buy Canada requirement, how much can be made in Canada, Buy Americas, and there's certain things like you can't have conflict diamonds in your, there are different contract clauses that are required that make it really darn complicated to buy in this business. But the fact of the matter is it's still a great market to be in. All right, it's distinct from the commercial marketplace. It's really large and diverse. Heavily regulated, so you got unique skills, but it's very profitable. The margins are lower, but you can really grow business in a significant way. And a couple of things that are unique about our business is, number one, you can get multi-year contracts. So you get, let's say, a 5-year contract from a government agency. And as long as you're performing, the government will exercise those options each year. Right? So that allows companies to really have a good sense of, here's my expected revenue next year, or at least my baseline. And so that can help with their workforce, in terms of employees and the like. And then the other thing that's good about the, is that the government often pays for your research and development. So they help kind of do that. So you get paid in advance. You also get paid in advance a lot of times, in advance of your deliverables. So it's a unique market, and it's very profitable, lots of cash flow. The margins are not quite the same. So anyway, so that's the overall kind of how government buys and the companies that are in the industrial base, how they interact. So let's talk about kind of what's how the U.S. is buying and how that is changing. And then U.S.-Canadian cooperation. So last Friday, right before I came up here, the Pentagon, Department of Defense, or Department of War released the National Defense Strategy. And these are the 4 pillars. Defend the homeland, and it includes the Americas, deter China, Indo-Pacific, increase burden sharing with allies and partners, and supercharge the defense industrial base. So two of the major pillars involve allies and partners and the overall industrial base, okay? And the department actually had set up they've put a lot of efforts into reforming how we do, how the government buys. And that's in the Department of Defense. It's happening in other agencies as well, but I'm just focusing on defense. And there are 3 components to that. One is about identifying what we're going to buy. And this is what the government does before they go to the marketplace, before they come to companies and say, this is they determine we need to have a new tank that does this for this has this kind of firepower, this kind of range. That is developing their requirements. Or in the case here, they're discussing getting a new submarine fleet. So the government needs to determine their requirements. How many ships? How many subs do they want? What kind of capabilities they want? That is developing the requirements, all right? And that's and there's been a big reform in the U.S. because that had become very cumbersome. It takes a long time. It was a lot of value add. I'm sure it's much more streamlined here in Canada. All right. The bulk of the effort was around how we do acquisition. How do we buy? How do we relate with industry? I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but that's the core of their acquisition transformation strategy. So, and this is when Secretary Hegseth gave a big speech on this in November. And the third component was security cooperation. How does the U.S. work with allies and partners? All right, and give them some atmospherics that are with the bilateral relationship and U.S. relationship with allies. Who would have put that on their bingo card? That one of the three components of this reform would be focusing on working with allies and partners. Okay. And this is a speech that he gave in November. The Secretary of War, Mr. Hegseth, and he said, "Foreign military sales allows our warfighters to stand shoulder to shoulder with allies to face dangerous global challenges." All right, so it's really important because if we have the same equipment, we have the same kind of standards, we operate together, we go to war together when it's required, and so having the same kind of systems allows us to operate more effectively together. And there are ways that enable this international cooperation, and a lot of these things are existing, right? So export controls. Does anyone know what export controls are? Sort of, it defines on what you can sell to whom, right? We have the U.S. and Canada. Canada has an exemption to the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation with the United States, an ITAR exemption. All right. They also have the DAPSA, their Defense Procurement Memorandum that enables U.S. and Canada to cooperate significantly. It exempts Canadian companies from U.S. Buy America requirements. Like I was saying, the U.S. considers Canada part of its industrial base. So these can help, spur cooperation they have. We have, like I said, we have respect for each other's procurement laws. We have a reciprocal defense procurement memorandum of understanding that enables more cooperation. We're founding partners, founding signatories of NATO, the NATO alliance. And then, of course, with NORAD, we operate and protect the homeland every day in Canada and the United States. And then subsidiaries, like I was talking about, we have businesses from both of our countries in our other countries. And those companies are U.S. subsidiaries, are U.S. companies. Canadian subsidiaries are Canadian companies. All right, so we already have this cooperation and these kind of frameworks that help with cooperation. Now, what are the benefits to this? And whether you do co-development, co-production, co-sustainment. The Boeing facility here in Manitoba was started as an offset agreement in 1971. I learned that yesterday from Wendell. So that was an agreement that was part of a Boeing contract with Canada. And in return, the Canadians asked for, hey, we want to set up we want you to set up a facility in Manitoba to help our build business here in Canada. Right? So when you were doing co-development, co-production, and co-sustainment, those are the kind of things that we do. Standard Aero here in Manitoba, they're focusing on maintenance, repair, and overhaul. Right? And so that is co-sustainment, right? And what that does is that leads to enhanced interoperability and modularity through common standard sharing and capability development. And there's numerous examples of where this can be done right. The F-35 is the largest program in the world for fighter jets. Canada is a member of it. Hopefully, we'll continue to be a member of it. And but 11 other countries. We got Israel, we got the Danes, we've got the Brits, a lot the Australians. They're part of this program. So when you have a big cooperative program, it becomes really, I mean, to use the term, from the U.S., too big to fail in some ways, because it gets its own kind of development and inertia, and that's good because it helps deliver overall capabilities to all the different countries. Another example is when we created vehicles during the Iraq and Afghanistan war to protect against improvised explosive devices or roadside bombs, the MRAPs. We were able to do that using an existing design that came from Rhodesia. Anybody remember Rhodesia? It's today's Zimbabwe. It was a 1970 design of a vehicle to protect against roadside bombs. And the U.S. took that, modified it slightly, and built 16,000 of them in 3 years. All right, because they bought from a bunch of different companies, used a lot of different suppliers, and I'm sure Canadian companies were involved in that, it really were focused on getting it to the field. And then the NATO Sea Sparrow, that's a missile consortium that's been around for 60 plus years. I'm not sure if Canada's a member of that or not. I'm not sure. No. And then there are bilateral initiatives. This is an initial on high-speed ramjet that was with Norway. We do them with Australia. I'm sure So, but when you do bilateral cooperation, allows the countries to get benefits, by being invested and in those efforts. Okay, so those are some of the benefits of cooperation and between the U.S. and Canada, or just internationally involved. This would be the same with Canadians cooperating with European partners as well. But what do we need to consider going forward? So I propose 4 different things. Right now is an historic moment, an historic opportunity. Speed is not enough. Then we're talking about incentives, and then I want to talk about flexibility and implementation. So this is an historic moment. As Andrea and the Consul General were saying, we have a moment where there's a strong recognition of the threats facing us. I served in the U.S. Army a long time ago, and when I graduated from West Point, I went to Germany in 1991. Right? And what happened in 1991? Or what happened right before then? Right? The end of the Cold War, the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Cold War. And that led to, we had some considered the end of history, and we had no kind of real major threat. And so that led to a dramatic decline in defense spending. However, the world has proved that it's still a dangerous place. Russia, invaded Ukraine in 2022, and as a result of that, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. It was the strongest kind of event of galvanizing the NATO alliance since really the end of the Cold War. The U.S. and other NATO allies have supported Ukraine since, which has led to some of the industrial-based challenges that we'll talk about in a little bit. But also the threats in East Asia with China, where it's a very challenging relationship because we have lots of business with China. The U.S. does, Canada does. The Prime Minister made a speech on this like a week or two ago, and those commercial businesses are strong, but yet at the same time, their threats, their security threats are real and significant. And that's led to response. Last year's NATO Hague Summit, the U.S., all members but Spain, I think, committed to a 5% goal on national defense, on defense spending, 5% of GDP. Most countries were well below 2%. At least we're below 2%. So then going up to 5%, that's Cold War levels. I mean, the commitment actually is 3.5% for defense, 1.5% for other kind of infrastructure or things that are kind of national security focused, border control and so on. But that's very, very different. And Canada is actually they have been below 2% of GDP spending for a long time, but now they're committed and raising funds, and I think they anticipate reaching that goal this year, right? And then they set the goal of 5% by 2035. So, here in Canada, you're waiting for the Defense Industrial Strategy, which was supposed to come out by Christmas, but Andrea screwed it up, and no, I'm just kidding, of course. It's not out. But that plus the stand-up, who's heard of the Defense Investment Agency? Okay, so this is going to be a new organization, and here's where we can talk about some of the lessons learned from the U.S. side. It's the whole idea of that investment organization is to help kind of develop rapid solutions to get them to the field, to the warfighter faster. So buy things quicker, help the scale more, so they're setting that up within the Public Procurement Canada, right? That group. All right, so those are not out yet, but for companies and for those that are interested in Canadian security and defense, now is the time to start thinking about, okay, what does Canada need to do? What do we need to buy? How do we need to do it? What are ways we can be more effective? That's where we need thought leaders like you all here in the center to get involved. And there's going to be tremendous opportunities for companies. I put 155 moment here example. So, in supporting Ukraine, there's a whole lot of artillery shells being used, and the 155 artillery shell round is used on a daily basis. But the stockpiles of those had been very kind of very minor. But so ramping production was hard. But the U.S. in December 2023, they signed a contract with 9 companies to build 155 rounds. I mean, the good news is 155 rounds are a NATO standard, right? So that you can, in theory, you can build them in any NATO country or close thereabouts, and they can work together. But there have been challenges with using where they're not exactly interoperable, but that's sort of something to be worked through. But the point I wanted to bring in December of 2023, the U.S. Army inked 9 contracts with companies to increase 155 production with a goal of 100,000 units per month. Three of those companies were not based in the U.S. One was in Poland, one was in India, and where was the third one? Right here, right? In Ontario, I believe, right? So it shows, there's opportunities for companies at all kinds of ups and downs, right? So that's what the moment and the historic opportunity. All right, why did I say speed is not enough? So for the last decade, the U.S. is focusing on innovation, right? We got to do things faster. We got to bring in Silicon Valley. We got to do these things because they have all the great ideas, right? And we'll apply them to defense. And that's had some great advantages, right? Because you got some really great commercial technology, and that you developed. They took it to Ukraine, to the field. Some of these companies brought their drones, but what happened? So some of these drones were spoofed just as quickly as the military drones were, because they didn't have the right protections, right? So sometimes speed is not always is part of the answer, but not the only part. Right, so there's been a lot of experimentation, a lot of prototyping in the last decade in the United States, and this has been under the Biden administration, under the first Trump administration, under the Obama administration. So Democratic or Republican administrations, big focus on how do we do things faster, how do we innovate. The challenge is innovation will help you get prototyping, but they won't necessarily get you an end product. You've got to improve then how you buy the end product. Because what happened in Ukraine, as we started using these, outside of 155, we used a lot of missiles. And has anyone heard of HIMARS or ATACMS and all these precision-guided munitions or missiles? And the challenge is those missiles, they're made in facilities that are built to the terms of a specific contract. They're not built so that, if you need to expand and double your production, you can just do it overnight. Companies have to make the most efficient use of government funds to build those products. And they build them by hand, essentially. And so when we started going through our stockpiles to support the Ukrainians, they turned to the CEOs of Raytheon and other companies and say, hey, can you double production? And they said, yeah, in 2 to 3 years, right? Because they have to do an environmental impact study. They've got to find new facilities, a new place. They got to build it. Then they got to test it and qualify it, right? So we've got to find better ways to scale production. So it's not that have to start anew every time. And that's been a big focus. That's the focus of my research and some of the work that I do with the Department of Defense on how do you scale that production so that you can have capacity that you can scale. You also need to measure innovation, and that's what these charts are about. There's a contracting vehicle in the U.S. called Other Transactions Authority, which allows you to get on prototypes under our agreements quicker than in general with government contracts or federal acquisition-based contracts, right? And Canada is looking to try to establish a vehicle like this. And it's grown significantly. It's grown from 220% in the last 5 years. But the problem is these OTs are prototypes. They are not lead to production. And we do not measure how many of these transition from these prototyping agreements to actual contracts. So we don't know how much it succeeds or leads to actual kind of capabilities. I mean, you don't want everything you prototype to succeed, but if you don't know how to measure it, then how do you measure the results of your innovation? You don't know what the outcomes are. Likewise, with small business, we have a program in the United States called Small Business Innovation Research, and that has kind of doubled from $3 to $6 billion in the last decade, and it goes to a bunch of different government agencies. The biggest ones are the Department of Defense and Health and Human Services, but other agencies do it. And those allow small companies to get contracts directly from the government on innovation. Like the MRAP that I mentioned that used that old Rhodesian design, they had to update it for use in Iraq. And that was done based on a SBIR grant that helped kind of do that technology. So these kind of ways of getting small business ideas into the system are really, really critical and a central part of how we develop capabilities. But the challenge is, again, we don't know how to measure it, the outcomes. We can measure how many awards we make for a phase 1 or a phase 2 SBIR. But then when it comes to what transitions to an actual capability, you have to go contract by contract. So if you really want innovation, you got to figure out also what are the metrics that you want to measure it by. All right. Third point is around incentives. So my point here is that incentives are the elixir of the industrial base. Right? So companies survive on the contracts, that the revenue they get from contracts. But the way the government gets companies engaged is by creating those incentives. A speech is not a demand signal, right? A government official saying, that we need this capability, industry, I need your help. That's great, but that is not a demand signal. An actual request for information or a request for a proposal is a demand signal for industry. That means the government wants to buy or is planning to buy something. So the government, it's incumbent upon the government, because of the monopsony structure, the government sets the market. So if the government wants different outcomes, if they want more companies in, they need to buy from more companies. Instead of buying just from one final product from one company, buy from two, right? So then you've got a stronger industrial base, a more expanded industrial base, and the like. Likewise, if you want companies to invest more, you can get them to invest by creating lower interest loans that enable them to buy facilities up in advance of contracts. You could do accelerated depreciation on investments for similar focus areas. So these kind of ways, that instead of just government dollars, how do you incentivize it through other like loan authority, tax kind of laws, tax incentives and the like. And we did a survey of over 400 firms last year, and we looked at what are how do you kind of, what are your key performance indicators? How do you measure the success of your business? And as you can see, I mean, there are two real groups. One is on revenue. I was like, how much money we're bringing in? What's our success rate? And the second ones are really kind of on business development. What is the pipeline like? How many opportunities are out there, right? So if you want, so this is how companies measure themselves. So if you want more companies, you want more investment, you want more opportunity. They got a bigger pipeline. They got bigger utilization of their labor. They got they submit more proposals, and then they got more opportunities for more revenue. So it's that it's setting the market to enable that success. And finally, their flexibility, implementation, and money are the key to ultimate success. There's an expression in the military, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy, right? So in the government context, developing a plan, developing a strategy is wonderful, right? But the key is you have to be flexible and find out if you're going down the wrong road, you need to turn around, right? So you need to find the way, you need to be flexible in your implementation to achieve success. And then to that point on implementation, follow through is everything. There have been, I don't know if it's the case here in Canada, but there have been myriads of efforts in the United States on reforming acquisition, right? But in general, sometimes the timing is not right or the conditions are not right. But follow through is everything. And it's the case in the United States. One of the best things about the current plan is that the administration did it in its first year. So they have 3 years to implement the efforts they laid out, because they've laid out these incredibly ambitious efforts in their strategy. But if they did it in year 3 of their administration, it would be much harder. And that's what happened in the Biden administration. They developed this industrial strategy, the first ever the United States has done. And I think this is the first ever Canadian industrial strategy that's coming out, right? That's what I was told. I could be wrong. But anyway, this is the first ever. But they published it in year 3 of the administration. Right? And then they developed an implementation plan. The implementation plan came out 90 days before the Trump administration came in. Right? So it was an implementation plan that they couldn't implement because they weren't in power anymore, right? So, and it's not a criticism of them, it's just the timing. So you have to be able to have runway to be able to implement these actions. And then finally, I'm going to just reiterate about, money is key. And I understand, I've learned in this week that the Canadian government does not have the greatest reputation for following through on commitments in defense spending. And so they have to follow through, right? They have to follow through. We're turning these, not just do reorganizations of government offices, but create opportunities for companies to really kind of deliver. That's the case in the US as well. Companies are not going to respond to speeches. They will respond to real opportunities. All right, those are my thoughts. Any questions? So.
Thank you very much.
All right, do we
So
close it?
We're going to come
Great.
sit over here. We're going to do a little bit of Davos-style question and answer. Then we're going to open it up to the public. So please have your questions ready, and I'll have a couple of students run around with the microphones. So thank you very much. That was really informative. I think, Canadians tend to complain about 3 things. The first is the weather. Second is our hockey team's not doing well or doing well. And then the third has to be waiting for the government of Canada to make decisions around either defense policies or procurement decisions. So maybe I can start by asking you, what is it in your estimation that the U.S. does really well when it comes to the defense procurement cycle, and what they don't do very well? And is this unique to the U.S., or are these issues that many Western allies face, including perhaps Canada?
Yeah, a great question. I think the first thing the U.S. companies and U.S. industrial base delivers the best products to support our warfighters and our partners and allies, are, bar none. The challenge has been too long to develop. They're over budget. They're too precise, and this is not just a company problem, but it's a government problem. So I think the systems ultimately they develop have been great, but we don't have the ability to really scale and to deliver kind of more affordable systems, and that has been a big focus on what they're trying to do, I think that the Canadian government can actually short circuit some of this by learning from some of those lessons. We could talk about that more.
You mentioned the demand signals, but you also said one of the big problems was going from an innovative idea to something that is maybe even commercially viable, so that it's reinforcing and continue to develop. And the U.S. has a really unique environment in that the government will help fund and support new companies, especially with disruptive technology, to get them on their feet and going. And I know you visited Halifax, where we have the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, or DIANA, which in some ways is doing that. Is that sufficient, or what kind of advice would you give to Canada about how you support, especially all these very, very small companies, which I think in the future are going to be key to how we win wars? How do we support their good ideas, especially in universities? Because I think that's one of the big challenges. We have, I think about Dr. Phil Ferguson and the amazing things his group is doing on space-based technology, but they are not commercial experts.
Yeah.
So how do we get their good ideas into something that's viable, scalable, and can be commercialized?
So I think what you have to develop is sort of an innovation ecosystem, right? And this developed over time in the U.S., like over the last decade, really, and it became a whole bunch of organizations all around the country focusing on kind of innovative kind of initiatives, such as the Defense Innovation Unit. Air Force had AFWorks. Navy had NavalX. Has Special Operations Command has SOFX. These kind of, and these are essentially accelerator organizations that have a little money that can do address specific problems that these organizations are having and give companies the opportunity to do projects to address them, build prototypes, do experimentation, and so on. And some of those have been open to non-U.S. companies, like DIU does that. The challenge is that this ecosystem developed over a decade and became kind of 1,000 points of light, right? And so that was great, but it didn't really help to then transition into real capabilities. So how do you take that, tap innovation, but then set ways to get beyond the prototyping into scaling? And that's what's starting to happen now. They've sort of repositioned some of the innovation efforts. And so I think for Canada, it's like, as you stand up this defense investment agency, it can't be just about getting these small businesses going, getting these new ideas in, but it's like getting mechanisms for those to lead into some final capability. And let me digress a little bit and talk about universities. One of the things that I mentioned that is it's got its warts too, but this program, Small Business Innovation Research, is also the Small Business Technology Transfer program, or SITR, and that is focused on universities. And that's the universities partnering with companies to transition technologies. So to the degree that the federal government, this new defense investment agency, can create kind of an accelerator or focus around addressing small businesses, and that is First Native small businesses based in university, getting them mechanisms to get into this innovation ecosystem. Because you want the companies that are from the garage or whatever like this, but you also want to get those ideas from university. So it's doing those kind of innovation efforts, but then the key is kind of where does it go from here?
Great, thanks. I have a kind of a cheeky question, but it strikes me that in the new U.S. National Defense Strategy, it puts a lot of focus on burden sharing with allies, which I read as please buy American for a whole bunch of reasons. First, our national interest, and also for things like interoperability. But it seems to me the communication strategy of many of the Trump leadership is antithetical to getting allies to want to buy U.S. products, such as, threatening X, Y, or Z if you don't do that. If you had advice for U.S. leadership about how you generate that cooperation with allies, what might you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I don't represent the U.S. government, but the rhetoric sucks. I mean, let's just be candid. It's called the elephant in the room. It's just if you tell someone you suck, you guys don't do enough, but you should buy all our stuff. I mean, that's those two messages are not really, don't really go together well. But if you look at the I guess my advice would be, if you look at the National Defense Strategy, the framing of allies and partners is we need increased burden sharing. We need you to do more, right? And they need you to buy more of our stuff. But if you look at the actual messaging, it's a bit more collaborative in the actual text, in the actual things that they're doing. They're doing partnerships with the UK and Australia are under AUKUS to build a submarine in Australia. They've formed an initiative, which I believe Canada is a member of, called PIPER, which is around Pacific Industrial Cooperation. Countries based, I think there's 14 countries, that are doing partnerships. They're focused on capabilities. This administration is not interested in sitting around a table. And they're not interested in Davos and having discussions. They're interested in actual results. They're interested in getting to actual capabilities. And one of the good things is, I wouldn't recommend the way they do it. One of the good things about saying to countries, we need you to do more, is that it's having an impact a little bit, right? Because, by sort of reducing the automatically expected guaranteed commitment, it makes you need to build your capabilities more, right? And, to really exercise Canadian sovereignty and likewise in European other nuance. And that's not a bad thing. I wouldn't recommend doing, the end product of getting more Canadian defense investment and defense capabilities, I think is beneficial for Canada and it's beneficial for the bilateral relationship. But we could do it a little with more carrots and less sticks.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm going to open up the opportunity for any of you to answer questions. So I'm going to hand my mic over to Lindsay, and she will scurry over since we're taping this. Thank you.
Yeah, you sort of yada the rhetoric and stuff, but I mean, how can Canada feel confident with interoperability when we have the Trump administration in Alberta stoking separatist movements, in Quebec also, ignoring joint defense obligations, Greenland, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would do is kind of reinforce the cooperation that's happening already, or that is happening today at bases in NORAD and in cooperative programs. These things are happening and they are continuing. And to emphasize those as kind of the reality of what's going on, and I recognize that the top level rhetoric does not help that at all. But we've had a strong base of cooperation and collaboration, and and that continues. And if we focus only on the rhetoric and kind of top level actions, and don't underscore and don't kind of also illuminate the things we are doing together, then it could have a more corrosive impact than that would drive down things that would be, I think, very destructive. But so I don't have a great answer, but I say, if you focus on some of the actions that are underway, that even if you get beyond the burden sharing and down to like the collaborative, there are actual opportunities to do things together. If you get beyond some of that top level.
Just to hot pursuit on that, it strikes me that one of the things that's making things far more complicated is that in the past, if we had a disagreement on a defense procurement issue or defense generally, it did not spill over into trade negotiations or other areas. But that means all bets are off. And so now everybody's on eggshells about something happening in one bucket could spill over into another. Is that resonating in the United States, do you think, or?
Yeah, I think it is, but I don't. It's still kind of an open. There's still a lot of reticence, to be honest. I mean, like the Canadian company that's participating in the 155 example I'm talking about, they're not advertising that. The Canadian government's not advertising that. The U.S. government's not advertising that, right? Because it could lead to a bad outcome, right? So I think I don't think this. Well, I don't want to make it. It's hard to see how this level of kind of rhetoric could be sustainable, over time, because there are good news kind of things, and I think those are going to, start to become more visible in time. So.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate your comments today. I especially appreciate the comments you made when speaking with Dr. Sharon about the role that universities can play. So we're speaking here in a university, and I think that we all agree that an important pathway to innovation is through universities. But I also want to bring up the topic of research security. So when we talk about doing research for dual-use technologies, we're increasingly facing the need to pay attention more to research security. And that also leads to questions about international students. So what does it look like in the United States and in Canada for us at universities to play a stronger role in defense procurement while still protecting the international nature of universities and the need for academics to continue sharing information publicly through conferences and journals?
Yeah, that's a tough balance. I mean, I spent 7.5 years at a university, and I think and our universities in the U.S., they spend a lot of times get hundreds of millions of dollars of grants from government and from the Department of Defense to do research. The challenge, when I was my last job in government, I was in charge of foreign direct investment. We called CFIUS, which is looking at non-U.S. companies buying U.S. companies, and we looked at what are the national security risks of a Chinese company buying land next to an Air Force base, right? And there's a similar organization, I'm sure, here in Canada that does, similar looks at that. And those national security risks are real, right? And I'm obviously not going to get into that. So, so you have to be clear-eyed about the national security risks in developing a research kind of program or portfolio in a university. And if you're going to do business, you're going to do research for the Department of National Defense, they're going to have restrictions. You're going to have separate, depending on the level of work you're doing, it could be separate facilities. It could be some international students that are Canadian citizens, fine. Some, no. It's just, based on the national security risk. And that, universities are just going to have to be able to find ways that they're to manage this. You want open inquiry. You want kind of academic freedom. I get it, but if you're doing work on national security for the federal government or for the and same for U.S. universities, that you've got to accede by those rules, and that requires lots of different things, and like facilities, certain students are, but doesn't mean you ban students from the university itself. It just means they can't be working on products for the Department of National Defense.
Dr. Ferguson brings up a really good point, but one of the things that is very different here, I think, is how we give security clearances. So if you're associated with a Canadian industry, they can provide a security clearance. But for example, most of my US colleagues who do defense policy, I'm not, creating the scramjet. I'm just looking at the governance of them and the rules around that. They all have security clearances because they are associated with the Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. Department of War. But here, it is very difficult for academics to get a security clearance. And the other thing is the security clearance is held to that particular silo in which it's given. So for example, I do have a security clearance, but it's in to advise on a particular topic to a particular part of Canada's Department of Defense. I can't then cross over to another part or another issue area within the Department of Defense to get the information. My impression is that's very, very different in the U.S. In that it's easier in many ways to get these clearances. Am I correct in that assumption, or can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the Canadian system to really compare, but it is not easy in the U.S. And it's gotten harder. You've got to be doing you got to have a specific contract or a specific need to know to work on a specific project. So it is really kind of done on a need to know basis. My organization I work with now, CSIS, we don't have a facility clearance at all, so we don't do any classified work. I guess my point is that I don't see the need for particular academics to make an impact. You don't need to have a clearance because you can have just as much of an impact with your open source research and analysis on overall D&D policy than having a clearance. Because you can't talk if you got a clearance, you can't really talk publicly about what you're doing, right? So I wouldn't. I'm not sure that there's that much difference, and I don't know how necessary it is. So,
We go in there.
Thanks very much for your comments. One of the structural differences between Canada and the United States is the legislative side. Parliament in Canada really has a marginal, if that, role to play on issues surrounding procurement and acquisitions. The problems we have are internal to interbureaucratic issues and, of course, then political involvement by the government. In the United States, you have Congress, which is an active player. I'm wondering in terms of based on experiences of the past, but in terms of the planned acquisition reforms you laid out that are underway, how will Congress play? And what type of challenge is Congress to implementation?
Yeah, great question. I think, you do have it, I think, a lot easier in a lot of ways, because if the government wants to do something, and, you just move out, right? Whereas in the U.S., the government proposes a budget, and then Congress disposes of the budget. They could basically say, nah, we don't want you to do that. We want you to buy more of C-130Js, right? That kind of stuff. So Congress does have a big role, but in the case of the acquisition reform things I talked about, that's part of the reason why it's an historic opportunity in the U.S. at least, because there's bipartisan. It's one of the few areas of bipartisan consensus. Both Democrats and Republicans, and Congress and the administration are singing from the same song sheet, right? Like when the secretary announced that acquisition reform effort in November, there were members of Congress there, right? In the congressional annual authorization bill, both the House version and the Senate version had significant acquisition reform efforts in there that made it into the final law. And so there are some differences, but the overall kind of thrust is that we need to be better at delivering, faster at delivery, and just revamping on how we do the system. There is kind of, we've had this weird thing happen in the last couple of months where the government is now taking equity stakes in some of the deals. That is kind of that's something that is really, really odd, and I'm not sure how that's going to play out. But there is big consensus on the major activities underway.
So Canada is waiting for its defense industrial strategy. And just to put it into context, Canada tends to release policies, not strategies. We've had a series of defense policies. And for me, the difference is policies tend to be more aspirational, whereas strategies are, we need to do X, Y, and Z given A, B, and C, and here's the clear end goal. If you could help pen for the government our Canadian defense industrial strategy, what kind of signals should be in there, and what do we have to be careful of?
Yeah, no, it's great. One of the things I teach in an MBA class on business and strategy issues in government contracting. And strategy, central to that is your strategy is how you do something, how you're going to achieve your objective. So that is, to exactly your point, what are the steps you're going to take? And so what I would urge in the industrial strategy is that it goes from the actual policy and the vision to the outcome. How are you going to get there? What are the steps? It's got to outline the steps to achieve the desired results, which includes investment, which includes policy changes, includes standing up some new kind of government incentive structures. The things I would try to really, really avoid is that government is not a business, right? So the profit and loss part of business, is the bottom line. In companies that don't succeed, go out of business. The incentive structures in government are different. And so often the first step in implement a strategy is do a reorganization, create a new agency, the Defense Investment Agency, and those things are necessary. Sometimes they're not necessary, but they're not sufficient. It's like, so you have to have that follow through in terms of the resourcing, in terms of the driving the organizational policy and process changes to achieve the desired outcome. So a strategy document can be a path, lay out how to get there, but you can't. You have to then follow those steps carry it through and be flexible in the outcomes and flexible in how you do it. Just, you know, the challenge is, you know, and I think Canada's had a lot of lessons in this from what I picked up in the last week is that, you know, saying is one thing, but delivering is where government has had challenges, right? So, and this, my U.S. is the same way, and it's harder because you're not outcome focused. But being outcome focused has got to be the key in getting the strategy and actually bringing it to reality.
Thanks. Oh, we've got a couple of questions there. So we'll start with Nick there, and then we got two in the back.
Thanks for your comments. Bit of an open-ended question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on IcePact, the collaborative effort between Canada, the United States, and Finland. In my mind, it's a little bit novel in the sense that the R&D is being shared amongst the countries, but the end product is also being built in different countries. Where does that kind of fit in within the industrial enterprise?
So this is how helps to kind of belie some of the top level kind of noise. Okay. This is, and the more than this can be explicated and publicly known, the better. So this is a deal for the U.S. Kind of ice pack, and so that they're building the first two of the icebreakers for the U.S. Where are they being built? You don't answer. Somebody else. No, not building. The first two they're building in Finland. Okay. Right, and then where they're going to build the remaining 5 or 6 of them? No, somebody else. It's a U.S. ship, so where do you think they're going to build it?
Canada.
No. They're going to build it in Alabama, okay?
Alabama.
In Alabama. But who bought the shipyard and who's going to build those ships in Alabama?
Canada.
A Canadian company, Davies. All right, so pretty darn interesting deal. The U.S. is building icebreakers. They're building them, the first 2 in Finland. They're building the rest in Alabama with a Canadian company that's doing the, I don't know, I think, is it a Canadian design? I'm not sure who the design is, if it's Finnish design or whatever. But so that's kind of a story of international industrial collaboration that kind of, in the Trump administration, that is beneficial for Canada, for Canadian company, for U.S. companies, and for Finnish companies. So anyway.
Just as a bit of a point of clarity, we do have, like you said, we are considered the same industrial base, so we have access to the U.S. defense. But that doesn't shield us from tariffs on those products. So there is still a bit of a barrier being put up to sell into U.S. companies.
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in tariffs, but I do know defense products are exempt from tariffs, right? So, but maybe dual use items, they're commercial, right?
They're dual use, but like technically they're dual use, but what we're selling is specifically for defense products, but they are subject to tariffs. So there is, and it's very specific to that product, but that there is edge cases like that come up. So just wanted
it is. Thanks for bringing that up, because I had meant to bring it up when I was talking earlier. But things that are sold from foreign military sales from the U.S. government to the Canadian government, those are exempt from tariffs. All defense sales are. Sales of defense items are exempt from tariffs under the, so.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, like with those tier 5 and 6 guys, like that's what we are. So we're selling them to a company who's then the prime on it. So it's, it gets a little murky there. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up and clarify.
It's a great point, and it'd be something that in the U.S. side that should be pushed for to expand that exemption, because it is a defense product.
We would love that.
Thanks. We've got a question at the back, and then we have one at the front here.
Thank you. I was interested because you were talking about this very structured government procurement framework, and you made the point that government isn't a business, it's a very different economic and decision-making structure. And if I think about current experiences and developments in conflicts, what's rather interesting is the most disruptive technologies are not monolithic technologies that are going to be sourced through these sorts of procurement fashions. They're actually rather agile and incredibly open source. If we think of drone technologies, which have made a significant difference in every theatre, land, air, and water, these are smaller, remote controlled, and the software side of this is completely open source in terms of its broad development because the concepts are well understood in terms of control. So I wonder how, if you look out in the future, this juxtaposition of a very structured system that you're talking about deals with such an agile market force, because it's the market and it's in the field and it does meet with the theatre.
It's a great point, and that's has anyone heard of Palantir or Endural, right? And so these are the poster childs for innovative companies. They're new primes or disruptors, companies, and these are really Palantir essentially is a software company, and they are very heavily involved with AI, and Endural, they also build products, but they have the same kind of capabilities. And they make the argument that the system is too scalaric and can't deal with these technologies. And right. Well, and there's truth to it. I mean, I'll never forget a buddy of mine. He was at a conference, and we was talking about government buys services by the FTE. Does anyone know what an FTE is? Full-time equivalent. A person, right? Person year. And so he's like, yeah, I'm going to go buy me some AI, which basically means buy people, right? And so it's a hard thing for the government to do in this structured way. And there are, like I say, this focus on innovation in the last decade has been the testing ground for a lot of these kind of ideas. And you are seeing more of that. There has been a creation of a new kind of acquisition process in the Department of Defense, focusing on software, because software has to be updated in cycles that is not conducive to general procurement, right? And so, so you're seeing more and more of these kind of efforts that, because like the F-35, the software in that is, obsolete by the time the jet is delivered. But they're aggressively working ways to buy capabilities that can be refreshed and be more agile. They do it through called modular open systems approaches. Is the U.S. side getting really good at it? Not really, but are they getting better at it? Yes. So I think it's a work in progress. And I mean, these companies, Palantir is getting hundreds of millions of dollars a year on contracts, and Endural and all these Open AI, Shield AI. The companies, they're having success, and if you look at like the acquisition strategy that the Department of War has laid out, a lot of it's on addressing these kind of issues. It's an evolving story, and it's one that you all are going to experience here in Canada. So what you want to try and do is not try to relearn all the bad kind of situations.
So I think we have time for a question there. And maybe we'll take the two questions together. So Yoon, give your question, then we'll give it to Elikam, and then we'll give the final word to Dr. McGinn.
Thank you for your insight today. As a student studying Canadian defense policy, I'm interested in the NTIB integration. While Canada is a part of the NTIB, but many Canadian companies still face barriers like ITAR when trying to work with the Department of War. From your perspective, what is the most critical steps needed to make the US-Canada industrial base truly borderless for innovation?
Great, thanks. And then we'll just go to Elikam, and then I'll give you the final word.
Thank you. And because I work for a provincial government, I would be remiss not ask you this. So I know the defense industrial strategy in the US is led federally, but are there elements that would be impossible to achieve without federal and local government, state level and local government collaboration? And if so, are there lessons of how the collaboration between the federal and state level or local government has led to innovation quicker and perhaps even sort of expanding on deliverables for us to learn, being the fact that our industrial strategy is still in the works? Any lessons would be great.
Great. So has everyone ever heard of the NTIB, the National Technology Industrial Base? So the NTIB is, when it was established in 1994, and it's been around before that even. And essentially, like I said, under U.S. law, it says that U.S. and Canada are one industrial base. It was expanded in 2015 or whatever to include all UK, Australia, and then a couple years later, New Zealand. So all the Five Eyes countries. When I was in government, I tried to implement this. This was change in law in 2015, and I was in government then. And the challenge with NTIB was that it was a sort of a policy declaration. Right? It was a policy declaration in law that said, you're one industrial base. But, that and $4 at Tim Hortons will buy you a cup of coffee. What does that mean, right? So it was hard to actually turn that into something. Because if it went to export controls, then that got all sticky. And so we did actually use that vehicle to help in the area of foreign and direct investment, sharing best practices there. But what would help the NTIB is what we've seen with AUKUS. So AUKUS is the Australia, US, UK partnership that was done on the Biden administration. And you know what it was focused on? What's the difference between NTIB and AUKUS? What is the focus of AUKUS? Anybody know? The focus of AUKUS is on a specific program. It's about building nuclear subs for Australia in Australia. And so the technology from the UK, they build nuclear subs, in the US. So so it's transferring that technology to the Australia, not to build nuclear weaponized subs, but nuclear powered subs, right? So it's on around a specific program. And so that necessitated that export control laws had to be adjusted to achieve that outcome, right? So the creation of AUKUS on a specific program and forced the governments to respectively change their export control laws to help enable that program to happen. So it was a real specific capability development and that helped drive kind of that industrial collaboration, because there was a government commitment to do it, and then that necessitated the bureaucrats to do the work to get it done, right? To be pejorative, right? So, and that required Congress to change the law on export controls in the U.S. Quite Australia. So it was a mutually committed desire on a specific capability area. Other thing about AUKUS is it's focusing on other areas. They have these tier 2 capabilities around AI and autonomy and so on. That one has struggled a bit more because they haven't focused on a specific area and a specific program. So that's why the NTIB struggled, because it was too policy and not enough reality. And then so if we want to do that, what you would want to do is do something bilaterally or more broadly within NTIB on a specific capability to help bring Canadian and U.S. defense industry more focused to address that and have more borderless. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. And then your question was again on
State.
Oh, state. Yeah. So our states. I mean, there's some obviously with the republic. As a republic, it's different. With Congress, they sort of represent. There are state level kind of efforts to position companies to win competitions. There is a lot of that, but it's usually not. But it's usually the vehicle for that is Congress in terms of members or caucuses within members of Congress, and they'll represent the state or local kind of voice on a specific issue. And it can be very beneficial. Sometimes it can be very parochial, like where you have, well, anyway, let me say, it can be really helpful. Like, for instance, Representative Ken Calvert, who's from California, and is a Republican. His partner in the Defense Appropriations Committee is a woman, a representative from Minnesota. And those two have worked together to create a program called, that is about rapidly transitioning technology. I call it AppFit. I forget what it stands for. But so they created this idea. They got into law. DOD was not really interested in it initially. And they said, okay, well, we'll spend the money. But what's happened is over time, that commitment and that initiative by those representatives from Congress helped drive kind of this innovation. So now the department has fully embraced it. And so the way it can happen productively in the U.S. is where a specific group of usually members of Congress, or sometimes it can be a kind of state level, can help lobby and represent to get things more to the front. It also plays a big role in keeping programs sustained, because the impact on jobs. Like there's a tremendous group in Ohio where they build the tanks. That caucus, the Lima caucus, is very significant. So it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen the same way, but it happens more kind of by where members kind of bring things in through congressional legislation. Those are some of the levers where the states, kind of get involved, if that makes sense.
So before I ask Lindsay Spears, who is one of our graduate students and doing a thesis on great power politics, to come and thank you, I would just like to thank everyone here in the audience for coming, and a special thank you to the US Consul here in Winnipeg for their close partnership with the Center for Defense and Security Studies. It's been really enriching, and long may it last. So, Lindsay.
Dr. McGinn, on behalf of the US Consulate and the Center for Defense and Security Studies, we just want to thank you for providing such an insightful and relevant conversation for us
Awesome.
today.
Thank you. Oh, that's very kind. So we hire interns, by the way.
Should be a great one. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and please look out for more such events in the future.